Welcome to another Heatwave edition of Novara Live. We really do have a treat for you today. When we said we were going to do a climate focus this week during the heatwave and some big interviews, obviously our number one target was Naomi Klein, and she did agree to come on, which we are very, very appreciative of. You'll know Naomi Klein, one of the most famous left-wing thinkers in the world, author of many, many books. Although for this interview, I was mainly referring to a book that she wrote in 2014, This Changes Everything, which was her very influential book on the climate crisis back in 2014. So I want to do a bit of a retrospective, sort of see how Naomi's thoughts have developed since writing that, what in the world has surprised her, what in the world hasn't over the past 12 years since writing this book. It was a very wide-ranging discussion. We talked about the climate movement, what it's got right, what it's got wrong. We discussed climate. She always argued in this book that the billionaires weren't going to come to save us. Clearly they haven't. So I asked her whether China, in fact, has. We also discussed geoengineering, AI, all sorts of different, often controversial topics. It goes without saying, Naomi Klein, incredibly articulate, thoughtful, well-researched person. Such a brilliant conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did conducting this interview. Naomi Klein, thank you so much for joining us on Novara Media. Absolute privilege to be speaking to you today.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the weather. We're doing our shows from home this week. I wanted to sort of put a spotlight on the climate crisis this week, partly to model what we think the mainstream media should be doing, sort of using extreme weather events to talk about an issue which is sometimes difficult to get people to engage with. And actually, let's just start with the weather. So I'm speaking to you from my home in London.
Yeah.
It's 33 degrees. We're on the 17th day of the year over 30 degrees. Now, there'll be many people in the world watching saying, over 30 degrees, stop pretending that you're in some kind of desert. This is moderate for many parts of the world. But the context is between 1993 and 2013, and we averaged 3 days a year above 30 degrees, and we're on the 17th day already. So it is a sign of quite how extreme the situation has become. But I wanted to start, what's it like in Canada? Have you also had a year of extreme weather?
I'm actually in a pocket of relative cool in British Columbia on the West Coast. But the East Coast has had that same sort of Atlantic heat wave that you're in. We have had a lot of drought where I am. So we're very worried about fires. We were already on drought notice in Vancouver in May. That doesn't usually happen, like where you have to conserve water. So it's technically a rainforest where we live. So that shouldn't happen. It's because we had so little snow. So the snowpack is basically gone. It's actually just hearing about a British film crew that was filming in Whistler, and they were furious because they wanted snow-capped mountains and they were promised snow-capped mountains. I won't say which show. But yeah, we had a heat dome here in British Columbia exactly 5 years ago, and 600 people died. It was the deadliest weather event. And like you're saying, Michael, it's not that it was so hot compared to I've been in hotter weather. It was mid-30s. It got up to 42 degrees. But I'll never forget the feeling of going outside. And I just was overwhelmed by this sense, and I don't know if this feels familiar to you, of like, this is not our weather. Whose weather is this? Like nothing about our ecology or architecture is built for this, right? And more than 1 billion marine creatures died during the heat dome. So the air just stank because all of the like mussels and barnacles just cooked on the shores. And but it was just like, whose weather is this? And it's just that strangeness, that uncanniness of living in a different planet than the one that we all grew up in. And yeah.
I've been using this week, as well as doing the shows, to go back to your book, This Changes Everything, from 2014. It's a huge hit at the time, really, really influential. I have to say, brilliant read. I know you've said you haven't read this book in a while. I'm not going to quiz you sort of page by page, but I thought as a basis for a conversation about how climate politics has changed over the past 12 years, to begin by asking you, what's changed in your thinking about the climate crisis since you wrote this book 12 years ago?
I guess honestly, I find it a sadder book to read now. I've taught bits of it. I teach undergraduates, and I do the introduction. I used to use the introduction in a seminar, and it's it's intense, right? When you read the beginning of it, and you know that it's published in 2014, and it's talking about all of these reports saying that we have a decade to turn things around, or we have 12 years, and so, I didn't think of it as a doom and gloom book, actually. I thought that it was at the time that the main message of the book is that we actually can do something. This is not humanity, this is an economic system that is at war with life on Earth, and the good news is that that's a human-created system that we can change, and so I guess the main feeling I have is that we've wasted a ton of time, that we didn't have, and that we're in it, and that the predictions were, if anything, conservative. Although, I mean, there's some of the projections around that we're on a trajectory to 4 to 6 degrees of warming have been modified, right? So that it's not that there have been some emission reductions, but emissions are still going up overall. Um, but on the other hand, I guess, another thing that has changed is that you don't really need to persuade people anymore that climate and capitalism are intertwined, right? Like, when that book came out, feel like it must feel a bit obvious, but you can forget that at the time, a lot like, the main conversation about climate was divorced from talking about economic growth, talking about, just the imperatives of a market economy, and the way that they clash with what we need to do in the face of the climate crisis. Now that point is pretty obvious. I have a section of the book, called "The Billionaires Won't Save Us." I think we know they won't now. There's a lot in the book about, the fakeness of green billionaires. That's not a point that needs much proving, because they've all just sort of decided to go all in on AI, and they're not even pretending anymore. Um, you know, I I spend a lot of time in the book talking about the clash between the free trade system, right? Like, the World Trade Organization rules and agreements like NAFTA, and what we need to do in the face of the climate crisis, and all of these lawsuits that were happening using trade rules to sue countries that were banning fracking or stopping pipelines. Now Trump has just said, "Actually, we didn't mean it about any of those rules, and we can change them whenever we want." So that's less of an issue. I'd say that I definitely maybe overstated the importance of those trade rules, because clearly they can just be rewritten at will. But that's an important thing for us to understand, right, on the left, that they were not nearly as binding as we were told. I don't know, what struck you? What did I get wrong?
Well, I wouldn't dare to say that you got anything wrong. I think obviously you researched this topic much more than me, and I've never written a book about climate change. As I say, I think it's an absolutely brilliant read. I think the absence, which isn't a critique of you, it's just that no one was talking about this in 2014, is that clearly the billionaires haven't come to save us, but maybe China has, right? So I suppose the big protagonists throughout the book, on my reading, are sort of um, the rich capitalists and maybe free market ideologues, and then community activists, sort of grassroots people blocking fossil fuel infrastructure. And it seems to me that actually over the past 10 years, sort of since the book was written, a new main protagonist has come forward, which is China, or the Chinese Communist Party, however you want to look at it. And the big sort of changes they've brought about are the collapse in the price of clean energy. And, you've said that the projections when you wrote the book were 4 to 6 degrees as sort of the central estimate for what warming would be. Now I think it's about 2.8 degrees. And that's not really because of any political battle that's happened in the West. That's because the Chinese system has managed to bring down the price of renewables. And so I wanted to ask you, yes, or how does that fit into your framework for thinking about climate change, given that development over the last decade?
It is a major development. The fact that the price of renewables has become cheaper. I mean, that's a huge difference. Um, and it's and you know, when I wrote the book, there was still kind of like air apocalypse in Beijing, and whataboutism about China was a huge talking point for why our governments were not gonna do what they were gonna do, right? It was like, well, we could lower emissions, but then China's just gonna roll out all these coal plants and it won't matter anyway. So that's a much less effective talking point than it was, although, you know, China is still expanding coal and their emissions are still going up, but much less steeply than than it looked like they were going to in 2014. That's definitely a shift, I agree. A major change. And that had something to do with community activism in China, right? I mean, there was this often gets, underplayed how many grassroots kind of, wildcat protests there were at the community level, um, over air and water pollution in China and how the Chinese Communist Party was forced to respond to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is a good point, right? So there was community organization. I mean, the reason the Chinese Communist Party, I think, put lots of effort into getting rid of the smog over Beijing wasn't because of climate change. It was because they were worried that their legitimacy would collapse if people stopped being able to breathe when they left their houses. I think that is a very important point. I thought one thing that China definitely isn't is in any way degrowth. They're very much like, we are a productivist state. We are going to continue raising living standards. And I don't think, unless I'm wrong, that sort of any of their climate policy has been about changing consumption. It's all been about how do we continue to grow and expand using electricity instead of fossil fuels and green electricity. Obviously, they are still building coal power plants, but the trajectory is quite clear.
Yeah, and they see huge markets, right? And they're right. I mean, this is gonna be very good for their economy, already is very good for their economy. Um, our like, in Canada, we are spending a lot of time just trying to block Chinese EVs from coming into our markets, and trying to find new markets for fossil fuels that we can't sell to Asia, that we thought we were gonna be able to sell to Asia, right? So, that's part of how AI has come to save the day, and you see this in some documents that have recently come out thanks to DeSmog, where you have all these fossil fuel executives going, "Yay, we found a new market. It's, data centers for slop because we can't sell this stuff to Asia like we thought we were." Um, so never underestimate capitalism's resiliency, and ability to do 2 things at once, 2 contradictory things at once, because, you know, I didn't make the argument in the book that there was no possible booming market for green energy. I made the argument that it was not going to reduce emissions at the speed required to protect a safe environment. And that's always been the argument, right? Nobody's saying that you can't sell a lot of solar panels and make a lot of money, or that you can't do marginal emission reductions. But that's not the same as a future where, you know, you're able to comfortably go to work. I mean, this is just the barest taste of what we've unleashed, right? So I don't think that we can really afford to look at some good news. I mean, we need to celebrate the good news where it exists, but to then take from that, we can just relax. The system is correcting itself. It's really not doing that. It's going to take a lot more.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think the argument you make that free market profit-seeking companies are going to solve the problem. I think, you know, China obviously doesn't dispute that in any way. They've got a very managed form of capitalism with a very proactive state. And so, you know, if the argument was that free market capitalism isn't going to save us, then absolutely there is no way in which China counters that, right? China is an argument why you need a big, strong state putting its thumb on the scales to
Yeah,
have any kind of transition.
but I also just think that they are that so the jury is out on whether even that can lower emissions at the speed and scale that we need,
Yeah.
because that's China's emissions are China is the world's largest emitter, and its emissions are still going up.
I suppose the speed and scale question, though, is also where I suppose I find some of the ideas that sort of the solution is political challenging, right? Because if the argument you're putting forward is that it has to be, or back in 2014, is that this has to be a political coalition, right? We have to transform systems, and we have to have a radical transformation of capitalism. And while sort of the Chinese model might not be getting us there as quickly as it could be, the sort of build a movement from the ground up, which takes the levers of power and then holds it long enough to make a transformation which can't be reversed by the next right-wing government that might come into power. It also doesn't strike me as immediately very, very fast, if you see what I mean. I wonder what you think about that.
I don't think either of them, I guess, are proving fast enough, which is why we are where we are. Um, but, I don't think that the argument is this is just gonna be done by grassroots movements alone. I mean, what we were really pushing for and, which I still believe we need is that intersection of pressure from below and, you know, proposals like the global Green New Deal. And I think you can forget how sort of, um, close we got, and it happened very quickly. I was involved in Bernie Sanders's campaign in 2020, where he was really putting forward a climate plan that was not just for the US, that was really about a transfer of wealth from the US to the global South, that that accounted for the fact that the US has been historically the world's largest emitter, and, you know, he lost, but he got a hell of a lot closer than many of us imagined, right? So, I think that's just part of the tragedy of the moment that we're in is, like, this kind of getting close and not getting all the way there, right? So, you can take from that, it's always impossible, or you can take from that, okay, we need to learn the lessons for why we didn't get further, right? And so, if I look at the kind of the democratic socialist organizing in the United States right now, I think it's a lot of people trying to learn the lessons of that moment about what was lacking in terms of infrastructure to sort of um, support a transformational political project. Right. I think that there was, I often say that the Bernie campaign was a bit of a shortcut. And I think the campaign the Corbyn project to a degree as well in the UK, where you kind of go straight for the top, but you don't really have the infrastructure below. Um, and then when that, reaching for that ring you fails, everyone just collapses and starts a podcast. And and attacks each other online. Um, that's our plan B, right?
What do you think about sort of how electoral politics has intersected with climate politics over the past decade or so? Because I think there was sort of a high point of
Yes.
it, really, wasn't there? When there were lots of people putting forward the idea of a Green New Deal. Um,
Right, and in that electoral cycle when Bernie was running, it was really everyone but Biden who claimed that they were in favor of a Green New Deal. Like, I remember there was that moment when there were, I don't know, 10 Democratic candidates on stage, right? This is when everyone was still in the race, and they were asked, who supports a Green New Deal, and almost everyone raised their hand. So yeah, it was popular. It was the thing.
I don't think this is necessarily true, but I think there was an idea that this is the winning formula, right? I think there were lots of Europeans who sort of had the same thing, sort of that how we're going to get electorates on side is this Green New Deal argument. Then Biden implements something which isn't the Green New Deal, but sort of has at least certain similarities to it, and he loses. And now I think what's happening is that centre-left parties around the world have looked at that and said, oh, actually, this isn't a viable electoral strategy. If we're going to do green stuff, let's do it sort of quietly behind the scenes and just talk about cost of living, which I think is the Labour Party's current approach. I don't know. Do you recognise that as sort of a sort of cycle that has happened? And if so, do you think it's incorrect for people to come to that conclusion that actually the electoral politics of the Green New Deal doesn't work as well as people might have hoped?
I mean, what I would say is that Biden did not implement a Green New Deal. In that the whole point of the Green New Deal was to directly improve people's daily lives, right away, right, and so that would mean that you're lowering electricity costs, you're lowering transit costs, you are directly creating jobs. I mean, it was modeled after FDR's New Deal, right, which was a very visible, proactive job creation program and infrastructure program that was visibly, doing everything from, opening swimming pools to planting, half of the trees that have ever been planted in the United States. Um, and millions and millions of jobs were created for young people, for laid off workers. It was you could see it, you could touch it, you could feel it. None of that was true, um, of the IRA, which even the name of it was incomprehensible, right? I mean, you think about FDR and what an incredible communicator he was, and the narrative work that went alongside. I'm captivated by this history, right? Because they didn't just invest in the infrastructure and in the job creation. They invested in filmmakers and novelists and theater troupes to go out and tell the story. I mean, I guess I like propaganda, go out and tell the story of the Green New Deal. I'm sorry, of the New Deal, right? And the poster art from this era is just so magnificent. Um, and you had this, the fireside chats and like, this is what we're doing, and this is how we're gonna pull ourselves out of these very difficult times. Um, I mean, some of it was weird. Some of the communication was weird, like, "Look at this wimpy young man who went into the forest and came out so strong and healthy," like, it was quite funny. But I guess it doesn't help, first of all, to develop this very arcane process that it couldn't get money out the door. They had to build in all of these, market incentives, so they didn't wanna do anything themselves. And they didn't create, national agencies to do the work. I mean, that was the whole sort of spirit of the New Deal era, was like, if the private sector isn't doing this, we're gonna do it directly. We're gonna create these agencies, which is the same way that governments responded, in the Second World War. Canada created, what is it, like 13 crown corporations, like just in the war efforts. There was none of that. And you had a president who, as we all recall, couldn't string a sentence together, right? So that did not work. And I don't think that you can look at that and be like, oh, I guess the Green New Deal doesn't work, because actually Biden was the one candidate who firmly was not going to do that. And so he didn't, and he did something else. And what he did was, more spending than we've had, with a kind of a cap and trade regime. But people did not feel it in their communities. So then when the right came along and said, the reason why you can't afford anything is because of all this green stuff, even though that wasn't true, you didn't know it wasn't true because you didn't have any lived experience of the program, or very little.
I'm going to let you into well, it's not a secret, is it? But I think, Naomi, you're responsible for me spending a night in a cage in 2012. So I was going to see you. You're not really responsible, don't worry. Don't worry. But this is the story. So it was at
I can't wait.
COP 15. Was it COP 15? Yeah, it was COP 15, wasn't it, in Copenhagen? You're
Oh.
giving a speech in
Oh my
Christiania,
god.
which is the sort of
Christiana, yeah.
anarchist commune in Copenhagen.
I'll
And
never
sort of
forget it.
mid your speech, some Danish anarchists decide to sort of set some cars on fire and start a riot. And then the riot police all come in, and then we're all running away from the Naomi Klein talk. And I think I end up sort of hiding in one of the sort of anarcho houses in Christiania, but then I get taken away to this.
But you weren't arrested.
No, I was. I spent a
You
night in the
were?
cage.
Oh, okay, okay,
So
okay.
I spent a night in one of those cages with lots of people. To be honest, I just fell asleep. I didn't find it very traumatic. I think I also got
I'm
a
just
fountain.
smiling because that is the only speech I've ever given where there was a riot that broke out right
Yeah.
in the middle, and I remember it's very distracting.
Did you
In this
finish
big
the speech?
tent, we heard some noise and we're like, "What's happening?" Well, people just decided to riot mid-speech.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know why. I was a bit annoyed, to be honest, that they'd set the cars on fire at that time, because I was like, we didn't really consent to being involved in this. But anyway,
Yeah.
this is just a
It was
segue.
not my fault.
It's not your fault. And this is a
Yeah.
segue into a question about sort of climate negotiations, sort of
This
the
is your grudge against the climate movement. This is why you're like, "Just let China do it already."
maybe that is the origin story. People could discuss that in the comments. No, I'm not. I'm not at all resentful about that. As I said, I actually got £1,000 compensation. I don't know who organised it, but it's twice
Oh,
that this has happened to me when I was sort of in my teenage years, late teens, early 20s, sort of. There was once where we got evicted from a squat, and then I got a bunch of money from that, and then I got put in this cage for $1,000, and that's quite good pay for me, especially at that time in my life. So if anything, I'll thank you. But anyway, this is a complete
Okay.
divergence from what we should be
I
discussing.
I
This is
I'm sure your viewers are fascinated by
yeah,
this.
this is a
This is what happens when you overheat.
this is what's happening because I don't have air conditioning in my flat. Anyway, this was a very long segue into a question about climate negotiations. Now, obviously, um, we were all there in Copenhagen because this was a moment of great hope
Yeah.
for the COP process. People thought that some sort of binding agreement would be signed up to there. Obama was there. It looked like finally there was the lead nation in the world was willing to get involved. It ended in great disappointment.
Remember the Hopenhagen? Remember the signs?
Copenhagen, and they had a big sort
They
of
rebranded the city
yeah.
Hopenhagen for
Um,
Obama. Oh
anyway,
god.
that didn't go well.
Yeah.
But then there was the Paris Accords in 2015. Um, what do you think about sort of how the international politics of climate change has developed since you wrote this book? There was that moment of well, actually, the disappointment in COP was before you wrote this book, isn't it? Because you mentioned it in there. You mentioned sort of a British activist saying, "I thought Obama understood it and he cared," and being like incredibly disappointed. Um, Lots of people then saw Paris in 2015 as the high point. What do you think is the legacy of Paris? I suppose that the agreement that was actually made.
Yeah, I mean, it was always a really flawed agreement, right? I mean, this was non-binding. It was this sort of strange thing of like, okay, everyone bring what they can, like we're not going to tell anybody what we actually have to do to stay in our global carbon budgets. It's just bring your best efforts. We'll add it all up and just be like, that's about half of what we need, right? And that's what happened in Paris. Um, the agreement didn't mention fossil fuels. I guess, you're catching me in a moment where I don't feel good about it, to be honest. I'm not gonna pretend that I think this has been a really failed process, and every year it's gotten, like, more absurd, right? Like, some other petrostate, is hosting it, and, they've put the head of their oil company in charge, right? I mean, this is what's been happening in the last few COPs, more activists have been deciding not to go, that it isn't really worth it. Um, I can say, in Canada, like Paris that was also the Trudeau moment. That was Trudeau, hand on his heart, we're back. Canada is back. And, we made a big show uh, of after having, a very anti-climate government under Stephen Harper for 10 years, that we were like the one, developed like G7 country that stood with the Pacific Island states to say that we actually had to strive for 1.5 degrees rather opposed to 2 degrees. And then the Trudeau government, bought a massive oil pipeline, tried to approve 3 of them. And now we have your friend Mark Carney as our prime minister, who has chucked out even Trudeau's very weak climate agreements and is pushing new pipelines and so on. So whatever that was, it was not binding, even on the governments that are still in power, who made some of the most kind of lavish pledges. And, one of the things that came out of last year's COP is that Colombia, which has shown had real leadership under Gustavo Petro, um, did a kind of coalition of the willing and held a satellite summit, like not a COP summit, of governments that and just a few months ago, of governments that wanted to actually talk about phasing out fossil fuels, like the thing that you won't talk about at COP. You'll talk about anything but phasing out fossil fuels. You won't even put the words fossil fuels in your agreement. I'll never forget being in Paris and doing a search on my phone. I was standing there was a protest out underneath the Eiffel Tower, and I had to like turn around an op-ed really quickly, and I did a keyword search on the final agreement for the words oil, gas, coal, and fossil fuels, and got no no results found on all of those words. I'm like, "What is this agreement?" That manages to not say any of those words. Anyway, Petro and hosted this summit of governments that wanted to get serious about phasing out fossil fuels. And this is part of the reason why the Trump administration spent the money they did and was as active as they were in making sure that the far right would win that election. It's a major blow that what is happening in Latin America right now. We're talking about Argentina, Chile, Honduras, now Colombia, um, and next stop Brazil, right? Is in October. They want a fascist continent, um, and I would say the two main reasons they want it is because of the leadership of people like Petro on imposing sanctions on Israel, the Hague Group, and also this getting serious about a fossil fuel phase out, saying the unsayable, saying we actually have to phase out fossil fuels.
So just to clarify, it was a fossil fuel. It was a treaty, wasn't it, that was sort of signed by a coalition of the willing to say we will phase out fossil fuels. Is that correct?
To have a summit just focused on the one thing that was not being talked about at these international summits, which is how are we going to phase out fossil fuels? Not to say that everyone was serious about it, but I think 40 governments went, and it was like the Hague Group around Israel, right, and sanctions on Israel and serious actions on the genocide. This was an attempt to do what Mark Carney made people think he was gonna be doing when he gave that speech in Davos and got all that praise, right? Like middle powers coming together and actually taking international law seriously. Um, Canada's not doing that, but Colombia was doing that. Brazil was doing that. That's on fossil fuels. But, you know, Spain has also been trying to do that, and what we're seeing is the Trump administration systematically going after the governments that have been actually trying to be a counterpower to rising fascism and take some these are not radical actions, doing things like saying, "We believe in democracy, we believe in believe in the Genocide Convention, we think we should actually meet our climate targets," right? Um, and and I don't know if you saw Trump's rant about Spain, um, yesterday.
I'm going to read you a quote from your book, which isn't from you, and I'm sure someone has done this to you before. So I imagine you're going to be able to tell me who wrote this.
Is it from Naomi Wolf? Who's it? Okay.
No, so this is endorsement of this
Oh,
change that we're
no.
doing. Well, not an
Oh,
endorsement,
no.
of
Oh,
a
no.
segment
Oh,
from a
no.
review. You know,
What?
don't you?
I
So
have a feeling I
it
know.
says this:
Shit.
Naomi Klein is a genius. She has done for politics what Jared Diamond did for the study of human history. She skillfully blends politics, economics, and history and distills our simple and powerful truths with universal applicability. Do you know who wrote that?
Yes.
Do you want to tell the audience?
No.
Okay, it's it's Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the
Yeah.
current, was he Secretary of State for Health and Science? I always get confused about what their actual departments are, but I mean, our audience will know who he is. What what happened? What happened to RFK Jr.?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the subject of another book. That's what I wrote about in Doppelganger. Look, I mean, RFK Jr. was not always the sort of full-time conspiracist, that he has become. I think the main thing that happened was this sort of campaign he went on around vaccines, and trying to establish this false claim between autism, and childhood vaccination programs, and then he kind of, um, used that playbook on the COVID, vaccines and, rode it all the way to, yeah, head of, HHS. Mhm. Health and Human Services. Yeah. I mean, he is a very prominent example of, what Quinn Slobodian and William Callison called diagonalism. And, I don't think that, um, that that the reason I knew him a little bit back then was he did a lot of work with the river keepers, right? He did a lot of work on water protection.
But do you have I suppose that is yes, your whole doppelganger book, right? Which is sort of like how people went down this rabbit hole and this pipeline. And so I just thought it just sort of when I was reading through, because when I open a book, I often do read the endorsements and see sort of like who was
Yeah.
praising this, and it just struck
We
me
didn't
very.
seek out the blurb. I think they just put it, as one of the reviews. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not saying that you asked the guy. This wasn't a gotcha. This was sort of how interesting
No,
it
it's very
someone seems
weird.
to
It's
you.
very, very weird to see that.
I suppose this does lead to another question maybe, which is, back in the early 2010s, there was a view on the left, which is if only we get these gatekeepers away, the sort of liberal or centrist establishment, let's say, who sort of own the media, sort of control what is read and heard. If only we get them out of the way, then liberation can happen. I'm not ascribing that opinion to you. I'm just sort of saying that was something that was in the air. And sort of the gatekeepers have gone. You can publish whatever you want on YouTube, Twitter, etc., etc. Everyone's doing their own research. The influence of the mainstream media has massively declined. Um,
Yeah.
what's replaced it hasn't really been sort of an atmosphere of liberation. It's been something quite different. I suppose, how have you sort of approached that? Do you now miss the sort of centrist gatekeepers, or do you think that would be the wrong sort of conclusion to come to?
Yeah, I think it would be the wrong conclusion to come to, and I think, I think the argument that many of us have been making for a long time is we need an information commons approach that, if you do believe in some kind of a notional free society, democracy, informed citizenry, um, y you know, media is not always gonna be profitable, and, and we have a right to good information, and we can't make good decisions unless we invest in good information and even when it doesn't make money. And, we both are in countries that at certain times there was more of the sense of like, this is why you have a public broadcaster. In Canada, we have such a huge country and such a small population that it's just very clear. There's no way you can have media that actually covers this sort of vast swath of territory that is going to be profitable. Like, it isn't profitable to make media out of moose jaw. But that doesn't mean that nothing happens there, you know? So there's been this there was a time when there was a sense of, like, that's why you have a national film board. That's why, you also want a bilingual culture. That's also not always gonna be profitable. You have to make decisions, and then we've just chipped and chipped and chipped away at that, and our public broadcasters have not acted very much in the public interest and have acted like, more in that gatekeeper role for a long time, haven't been even willing to defend the principle of public broadcasting out loud, sort of are a little bit ashamed of it, right? And act, in many ways indistinguishable to, a lay viewer or listener from the private sector. So why should you defend it, right, when it gets attacked by the government? Um, but yeah, I don't think the idea was ever just like the problem was that there are people who have standards. I mean, that was never the argument. The argument was about the failures of the profit motive be governing our media sphere. And as there was more and more consolidation, and this is what I wrote about, in my first book, in No Logo, was like, as when this, like the era of like making these charts, like who owns what, who Disney owns this, what, like, and just realizing that was sort of our sort of political aha moment of like, oh, okay, so it's like GE that owns the news, and their interests are not primarily in news, right? Their interests are, they have other interests, other things that they want from the government that are much more important to them. Now, that's something that more and more people understand, particularly in the United States, right, where you have these big media conglomerates that are perfectly willing to turn their news organizations into, ways of endearing themselves to Trump so that they can get a merger in another area or, a piece of deregulation or stay on his good side when it comes to a trade deal or something like that, because news is a tiny part of their business, right? So that was what we were critiquing. I mean, in the sort of alter globalization era was corporate news, right? It was not, I mean, we didn't like the gatekeepers, but that was not the main critique, as I recall it, in our sort of Chomskyan, uh,
Yeah,
age.
it's more about media ownership than there being any gatekeepers whatsoever. Um,
No, I think it's good to have standards, and I think when everybody is a little micro entrepreneur, it has real risks, right? I mean, I do think, um, like, I'm on social media, like, I'm just trying to figure out how do you do how do we do this in this Wild West? Um, I think we should all be, like, a little less invested in defending it because we didn't build the system, we didn't ask for it. Um, Most people are just trying to figure out a way to make a living and get their ideas out there, and we should probably admit that there are real hazards when you're selling directly to your readership or your listenership. Um, there's audience capture, there's all kinds of things that happen, and admitting that and talking about it, doesn't, I think, compromise your work. I think it's better to be transparent about the hazards and see what you can do to build in some safeguards.
I was going to say this till the end, but actually, this is obviously so directly linked. You've just started a Substack. It's already got 34,000 subscribers in 24 hours. I just looked. So congratulations. It's called Patterns. What's your thinking behind that? Because I suppose this is, Substack is another one of these platforms where you speak directly to an audience. Um, Obviously, it gives you complete independence from any corporate influence. Um, the danger, I suppose, is audience capture. But yeah, how are you thinking about that? What's your thinking behind this new Substack?
I mean, part of it is just about feeling the constraint, just feeling there are too many rules on the various social media platforms. Like you're conforming to their space, to their word limit, to their format. And what I was seeing of Substack was that like of these platforms, it has the most flexibility in terms of like I can talk for I can write for as long as I want, I can talk for as long as I want. Um, so I like that. I don't like that I don't like that there's no control over the ownership structure. I mean, I think all of these things should be, worker co-ops. Um, like I said, like, I think we're all trying to figure out these broken systems. I used to post all the time on X, because of the research. I I've been spent the past year writing this book with Astra Taylor called End Times Fascism, and I'm gonna be coming back, and I think we're doing a conversation with Ash, in September in person, and I'm really looking forward to that, and we'll unpack it. Astra will be with me, but, the more you dig into the tech side of what we're calling end times fascism, and here we're looking at the sort of patterns between the sort of religious end timers who want their little, escape golden city in the sky for the chosen few, but also the tech end timers who are just like, they're building the next stage of human evolution if you listen to Elon Musk, and it's not for everyone, or Peter Thiel. It's for the chosen. Their rapture is on earth, they don't need and God's involvement, although Peter Thiel claims that, he's very religious. Anyway, um, the more you dig into them and really spend time with their writings and postings and th I don't know, though, the worse it feels to be posting on Elon Musk's platform, the worse it feels to be voluntarily giving them your views, your data, your clicks, being like because they are doing pattern recognition on you, like, that's all they're doing. Um, you're being mined constantly by them. So, um, and frankly, Musk could buy Substack tomorrow, right? Like, it there does seem to be, and this is why I think it is fair to talk about in the context, like, as fascist. It's not just the salutes. Um, it's that really there is this drive to control the truth, right? There is this drive to create a truth machine. Musk and Quinn and Ben Tarnoff write about this in Muskism, and I think you've had them on, talking about it, but that what they want is to control the answer to the question, right? Like they want when you do a search to control the result, right? Um, Musk wanted to call XAI Truth GPT. That was his original idea for a name. And, you watch him go after Wikipedia. He's obsessed with Wikipedia, which he calls Wokepedia. What he doesn't like is that there is a place that isn't one of their chatbots where people go to find some semblance of reality, right? Um, and you look at the war on universities and the war on journalism, and you see systematically that all of these other sources of, trying to map our reality that we have, right, through, independent media, scholarship, um, whatever, Wikipedia, like they're trying, like all of them are being attacked really aggressively. So, yeah, I guess I'm just, wanting a space that is not that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I like, if I were a good writer, I would have a Substack, but I'm not, so unfortunately I don't. But I mean, the good thing about it is it doesn't destroy your attention span. So sort of like Twitter, most of the other apps, I think, really mess up your attention span, whereas Substack is actually quite demanding to sort of like sit there and read a whole article. So I like that about it.
Somebody asked me, like, I was just talking to somebody who's not political, or you just, you get these wake up calls where I was just mentioning Substack and they asked what Substack is. And I was like, oh, how do I explain Substack to somebody who, and I was like, people write newsletters. And she looked at me like I was like, why would you do that? And, and I said, it's a place where fired journalists go to talk to each other. She was like, oh, okay.
Um, I want to talk about the climate movement. So I think,
Oh,
there's,
by the way, subscribe to my Substack.
yeah.
I don't think I did a very hard sell there. The place where no,
What's the
um,
URL? What's the URL for the Substack?
it's called Patterns. Yeah.
Pattern.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, and also, like, I do think that our attention spans are pretty wrecked, and so one of the things I'm excited about doing there is, like, an actual kind of book club where Astra and I read the book alongside you and chapter by chapter and have discussions. I do feel like we don't want our brains to be shredded in the way that they're being shredded. I feel it myself. Um, it's understandable given that we're in this kind of shock blender all the time, and we're on these apps that are designed to distract us. So I think creating a little bit of scaffolding, creating a little bit of infrastructure to help us stay with a thought together. I mean, this is what we do, in university seminars, and it's not a bad technology, and I think we should try it.
Yeah, I love that. I find that incredibly persuasive. I mean, sort of our audience is now sick of me talking about how TikTok and social media is melting everyone's brain. So we shouldn't dwell on it too long because they're always like, you're talking about social media and smartphones again. So let's move on to a different topic, which is, I know I brought it up. I can't help bringing it up, whoever I'm speaking to. The climate movement. I think it's probably, if we would say who is the most significant influence on the climate movement over the past, you know, 10, 20 years, I think you'd definitely be up there. And I want your views, I suppose. What have been the high points, the low points of the climate movement since 2014? What has sort of surprised you on the upside? What do you think didn't really work? I mean, obviously, maybe that's a controversial question, but so I don't know. I don't know how do you relate to the climate movement at this point in time?
How do I relate to it? I'm part of different, little sort of think tanks and research groups that particularly doing work on what's sometimes called green economic populism or working class climate politics. The Climate and Community Project. I'm a founding member of their board. And they've been working with this frame, and I'm co-director of something called the Center for Climate Justice at University of British Columbia. And we do a lot of research on this intersection of housing, like tenants' rights, for instance, and climate impact. So I'll give you an example. We started talking about heat domes. You're at home because it is so very hot where you are. So when we had a heat dome in Vancouver and 600 people died in British Columbia, one of the things that happened is that landlords started sending eviction notices to people who installed their own air conditioning because because they didn't want the air conditioning units, even though these apartments are, as you know, like not built for this kind of heat. So people are doing everything they possibly can to cool them down, and obviously installing fans, but also installing unregulated air conditioning units. And these landlords, people started taking pictures of their eviction notices that they were getting from their landlord saying, "You have overused this fan, you have overused this aircon unit." And so then we thought, okay, so what the demand should be is like heat pumps for all, right? They use less energy than air conditioning units. They should be a right. We should have a right to cool in the same way that a landlord can't turn the heat off in winter. They should have a duty to cool things down in summer. But what we found was that tenants' rights are so precarious that tenant organizers are actually opposed out of the gate to almost all green retrofits because they know that landlords will use it to do what we call renoviction. I don't know if you use this term, but renoviction is what it sounds like. Basically, you do like a little tweak to a unit, make it a little bit better, but it could be very small, coat of paint, new gate, and you increase the rent by, $1,000 and get rid of your lower income tenants. So trying to map this is, like I think how we're going to break out of this talking point that has done so much damage on the right, which has basically said, if these greenies get their way, the cost of living for you is going to be so much worse. There are a bunch of privileged people who don't know, what it's like to have to pay the bills. So I'm encouraged by the fact that, Zoran Mamdani ran on free public transit, didn't talk that much about climate, but didn't have to. That's a climate solution, right? Talking about public excellence in free transit, like that's a climate solution, and that's that's the kind of thing the climate movement should have been focused on, from the get-go. So yeah, I think there have been a lot of high points. There have been a few low points. I remember a moment when some protesters in London disrupted the morning commute, right, for workers, and that communicated like, we don't care that you've got a job, right, as opposed to, hey, we want to make the tube free and better. So yeah, anything we can do to break this idea that you have to choose between, as the Gilets jaunes said, you care about the end of the world, we care about the end of the month. We have to relentlessly send the message that the climate movement cares about both. Maybe it doesn't even call itself a climate movement. I'm heartened. I actually think the fight against data centers is single-handedly reviving the climate movement. Um, and it's, I always think it's a mistake to try to recapture something that's already happened. And there's sometimes been this, um, because there was such a high point right when the pandemic hit, right? Like the sort of 2019, 2020 youth-led climate strike moment, right? Where you had broke every record in the climate movement in terms of just numbers of people on the streets. And then the world shut down. There was this feeling in a lot of climate conversations that really we just had to like do what we were doing when we were so rudely interrupted, by the pandemic, and that never works. You can't go back. You can't go back politically. So I think we're now starting to see what the next iteration of this is, and I think why part of the reason why I feel very hopeful about the possibility of connecting the dots with AI is that, in This Changes Everything I do, as you say, I wrote a lot about these grassroots fights against oil pipelines, right? But or gas pipelines or fracking, something local. But what the fossil fuel companies could always say then was like, "But what we're doing, we're getting something that everyone needs. Like, everyone needs the gas to keep the lights on, or you put petrol in your car," right? Like, those were the fights, and you're familiar with them, right? And so then you cast the climate movement as these people who just don't care about the fact that, this is actually gonna bring your heating costs down, which of course isn't the case, but they make the case that it is, right? But in these data center, fights, what are they what are they doing? Like, they're building technology to, by their own account, destroy your job, right? Um, and they're making your electricity prices go up so that they can destroy your job. Like, it is the worst offer capitalism has ever come up with. Um, it's building our coalitions for us if we let it. in the US, the only thing standing in the way is the fact that the Democrats are taking so much money from big tech that they will not seize this, gimme of an issue that has so much cross-partisan support.
I mean, they're also led by some of the most dislikable people imaginable. We often show this wouldn't offer. We've done it a couple of times on the show now in segments. The clip, I don't know if you've seen it, where Peter Thiel is asked by Ross Douthat from the New York Times,
Oh, I've seen it.
"You want humanity to
The pause heard round the world, yeah.
you want humanity to continue existing, right?" And he's like,
Define
maybe."
humanity.
um, actually, I'm
Yeah.
not sure how to segue to this, but a controversial issue. So
Mm.
in your book, you talked a
But
lot about.
before you even get there, we're almost out of time. You're, like, setting me up to have to hang up on you.
No, no, this is. We've got 7 minutes. We can do geoengineering in 7 minutes.
Oh, geoengineering, okay.
Geoengineering. Geoengineering is takes up a chapter in the book. You give loads and loads of reasons why people should be very sort of concerned and suspicious about it. I think the obvious one that's most worrying is if it sort of changes the rhythms of the monsoons, which could be very bad in tropical regions. There have been some shifts since you wrote the book. So James Hansen, who was the guy at NASA who gave that sort of very famous first speech to Congress in the late 80s, sort of talking about the danger of the climate crisis, also actually features in your book because he was arrested twice protesting the Keystone pipeline. So he's not a corporate shill. He has, in the last 3 years, I think, come out saying, actually, the situation is so bad that even though it has a lot of downsides, we really do need to start doing serious research into the possibility of geoengineering. Basically, I think he's interested in marine cloud brightening or stratospheric aerosol injection. I don't really want to have a debate about the science of geoengineering because
Yeah.
I'm definitely not equipped and I'm not sure if you are, but I don't know if you've,
Well,
how you've sort of,
so people know stratosphere, like, what you're talking about is deliberately spraying particulate matter into the upper atmosphere, probably using planes. Some people talk about a giant tube to the sky in order to dim the sun, so sort of whiten the sky so that the heat of the sun is less strong in the same way that it's less strong. Like pollution does reduce heat in a strange way. So more pollution to solve pollution. Yeah.
the James Hansen argument was, he was saying that we've already done this by accident in the opposite direction because his argument. I know there are lots of people who disagree. So Michael Mann's a climate scientist who's completely on the other side. James Hansen says that one of the reasons why the oceans are warming up so dramatically since 2020 is because there was regulation to reduce pollution from the shipping industry. And actually, the pollution from the shipping industry, while bad for many reasons, was doing a decent job at reflecting the sun. So he's saying we kind of already are doing some geoengineering by accident, and maybe we do need to start researching doing it on purpose.
Researching it versus deploying it. Yeah. I think the problem around researching geoengineering, and I get into this, and this is, I'm having to dig pretty deep because I haven't done new research in this area in a long time, just to be upfront about this. Um, but the critique, right, is like there's lab research, right? There's the kind of like very small scale experiment, theoretical experiment, computer modeling experiments, um, and nobody has a problem with that. Um, but then the question is it possible to do a field research, like in terms of the kind of research that would try to replicate it, right? To actually see like to what extent would it interfere with the monsoons, right? You can't there is no model that you can do short of actual deployment, right? So the question is, are you deploying it? Not are you researching it? And if you're deploying it on such a small scale that you're just testing to see whether, okay, the technology works, can we actually dim the sun in this small area? Well, then you've answered one question, but you haven't answered the most fundamental question, which is, are you going to interfere with the hydrology that billions of people depend on to survive? Because that's the question, right? And I think the thing that is really scary to me, and what I wrote in the book is, we like often when I went to these um different gatherings of scientists who are doing that lab-based research and who have been pushing to do more field research, more deployment. And they they always talk about, okay, well, if we do this, we need to govern it very responsibly, very ethically, and then there's suddenly that we're talking about like a Star Trek like world where you have this fantastic democratic council and you have representation from the global south and you have all of these safeguards in place. And it's like, okay, where are we doing that? Like in this world, like we can't even regulate nukes, right? Like there's we live in a world which is going in the exact opposite direction, that is systematically dismantling. If you really want to scare yourself, watch the press conference of the scientists who set the doomsday clock every year. Watch them from this year, where they talk about how on every sort of existential risk, whether it's nukes, whether it's biological weapons, whether it's AI, the existing international regulations are being dismantled by the Trump administration mainly, right? So we have to imagine how AI, not how AI, how geoengineering would be deployed not in a notional Star Trek world, but in our actual world that is going increasingly fascist. And when you think about technologies that where people sweating in London or dying in London and Paris could decide to pull the trigger on a technology that, oops, sorry, interfered with India's monsoon. Is that so hard to imagine that the same logic that is saying, batten down the hatches, don't let the migrants in, get them out, remigrate, right? Like we're already sacrificing Black and brown people to the climate crisis. That's already happening with our politics. So all I'm saying is if you want to talk about geoengineering, I need you to talk about it in the context of fascist geoengineering, because that's the world that is happening right now. Those are the people who would pull the trigger.
I mean, I suppose Kim Stanley Robinson in Ministry of the Future, I suppose he sidesteps that by having the Indian government doing it, right? Because they
Yeah.
do it in response. Because just as you say, sort of, and I mean, I think you make the argument really well in the book that it
I don't
seems.
know how many times Ken Stanley Robinson has to tell us that he writes these things to warn us. He's like, "Hey, Elon, like the Mars thing was like, don't, like that you weren't supposed to just try to do it. That was a warning. We're supposed to actually cherish this Earth."
Yeah,
He's
cherish itself, but also as plausible, isn't it? Because it probably will be the global south that has the first really, really catastrophic climate event if we don't do geoengineering. So
Yeah,
he's
it
saying
is.
that then they're also, it could quite possibly be the case that they're the first ones to pull the geoengineering trigger. And therefore the argument from James Hansen, et cetera, would be if we are going to pull this trigger at some point in the future, we should know as much as we possibly can.
I think it's much more plausible that it would be a global North power, a Trumpian power that would do that. But it is also possible that multiple powers pull the trigger simultaneously because in the world that we live in, we are cooperating less and less, right? Then we have to imagine these, geoengineering wars, right? Like you interrupted our monsoon, we're going to interrupt your summer. We're like this is as if it's everyone for themselves, and we're deploying geoengineering. That's we just have a moral duty not to imagine best case scenarios with something like this, right? Like, we've gotta go Doctor Strangelove on this. It's important.